If the Archaic period was the time of the rise of the Greek polis as an independent unit of local political control, then the Classical period was the time for the polis to stretch themselves beyond their own borders. A few of them, at least. The more powerful polis eventually were able to bully smaller ones around and create mini empires for themselves, until there were two major powers or superpowers in the Greek mainland. It was virtually inevitable then that they would come to clash with one another, and with devastating results. Going into the Persian Wars, Sparta already had a respectable alliance network that it was able to assemble by virtue of its superior infantry. In theory, this league was a network of treaties for mutual defense of the Greeks of the Peloponnese, that southern peninsula of the Greek mainland. In practice, though, because of Sparta's formidable hoplite army, policy of this league was largely dictated by Sparta and its assembly. After the Persians had been expelled from Greece, the newly liberated Ionians and the islanders were very fearful of a Persian return, and so they formed an alliance with Athens, if you remember Athens' navy, for mutual defense, along similar lines as the Peloponnesian League. The agreement that was reached was that League members would send either ships to sail in Athens' navy, or money to Athens for Athens to maintain and build more ships. That navy would be the major line of defense in the event of another Persian invasion. Almost all League members decided to send the money. It was just easier. Athens brought in more money from its League members than it needed to outfit its fleet. A lot more money. If you want to get a sense of just how much more, take a trip to the Athenian Acropolis or look at pictures. Here's an artist's reconstruction of what it would have looked like in the ancient world. The marble buildings are in ruins now, but you can still see just how lavish they would have been in antiquity. The Parthenon, in particular, housed a 38-foot tall statue of the goddess Athena. The statue had ivory skin, and it was dressed in a peplos, or a dress, made out of solid gold. This was all paid for with League money. If any League members tried to opt out of paying their tribute, the Athenians would argue that it was unfair for someone to receive the benefits of the Navy's protection without paying into the Navy. And so, the Athenians would send their Navy to blockade the League member, who was usually an island. None of the Aegean islands is self-sufficient, and so without trade, the islanders would starve. Athens could use its navy to besiege an unruly League member until that member was forced to agree to continue to pay tribute to the fleet that was oppressing them. Athens and Sparta had fairly well-defined spheres of influence and interest in Greece, with Athens roughly controlling the coasts and Sparta the inland. However, in an age of meddling, it was practically inevitable that the two superpowers would clash over who got to be boss of what allies. So, about 50 years after the final battle of the Persian Wars, Sparta declared war on Athens. Most of what we know about the war is recorded by the Athenian general Thucydides in his history, which many people today still consider to be the first work of true, serious political history. Since Thucydides wrote from an Athenian perspective, he called the war the Peloponnesian War, that is, the war against the Peloponnesian League, and the name has stuck. The war was declared by a majority vote of the Spartan assembly, but not everyone was in favor. One of the most outspoken opponents was one of Sparta's two kings, Archidamus, who said, "We will bequeath this war to our sons." And they did. The Peloponnesian War lasted for almost 30 years. The first phase of the war lasted 10 years. We call it the Archidamian War, after the Spartan king, Archidamus. Even though Archidamus was against declaring war, once the war was declared, he led the Spartan army to invade Attica, the land controlled by Athens. The tactics of this phase of the war are so outdated as to be comical. As this map demonstrates, Athens and its Acropolis were a few miles inland from the sea, and so the Athenians had built mammoth walls around the city and then down to the harbor, since the sea was the real source of its power. When the Spartans arrived, the Athenians simply crowded in from the countryside behind the walls and waited for the Spartans to leave. The Spartans left a few weeks later. It is true, the Spartans had burned the Athenian crops, but Athens was wealthy enough to be able to import grain, especially from the Black Sea, and so to survive. This went on every harvest season for 10 years, as though the Spartans somehow expected a different result each time. This whole business dragged on until people finally just got sick of it. In the meantime, the Athenians managed to corner some Spartan citizens on an island and take them hostage. The Spartan hostages were used as bargaining chips in a series of negotiations that ended in what we call the Peace of Nicias, a treaty meant to end the war. The major provisions of the agreement were that Athens and Sparta were forbidden to interfere in each other's spheres of influence. Now, since the whole war started because there was not an agreement on exactly what the boundaries of those spheres of influence were and whose allies would be whose, the peace was doomed to fail. And this supposedly 50-year treaty only lasted for 7 before Athens and Sparta began openly fighting each other again. There's a fascinating piece of history during this period called the Sicilian Expedition, which you can read about in Martin. The Athenians thought that they would be able to conquer the city of Syracuse on the island of Sicily, which was a Greek colony, a fantastically wealthy Greek colony, incidentally. Sicily was a colony of the Greek city of Corinth, which was a member of the Peloponnesian League. And so when Athens invaded Sicily, it was taken as a provocation against the Peloponnesian League, and was one of the reasons for the return of hostilities between Athens and Sparta. Incidentally, the Sicilian expedition was a catastrophic failure, nearly destroying all of Athens' fleet at the time, leaving Athens to tap into its reserves and build a whole new fleet. When the war resumed, the Spartans finally woke up to the fact that doing things the old way was not really getting anyone anywhere. They made 2 strategic pivots. First, one of the Spartan kings staged a commando raid on an Athenian border fort at Decelea, and he occupied it. This provided the Spartans with a place from which they could harass the Athenians all the time, and not just during the campaign season. From the fort of Decelea, we call this last phase of the war the Decelean War. The second innovation was even more radical. The Spartans realized that they needed to be able to challenge the Athenians' naval power in order to cut off its power source. To do that, Sparta needed money that it didn't have. This meant finding some wealthy new ally to supply funds and also to supply ships to Sparta. Someone in the east, near Athens' empire, and presumably with a reason to hate Athens. When you put the matter this way, it's actually quite obvious what the next step is. The rank hypocrisy of Sparta's new alliance with Persia deserves a moment of reflection. Persia's help to Sparta did not come for free. The demand in return for bankrolling Sparta's war effort was for Sparta to agree not to interfere with Persia reclaiming control over the Ionian Greeks of Asia Minor, or Turkey. Now, at the beginning of the war, Sparta claimed that it was fighting Athens in order to free the Ionians from the tyrannical Athenians and their empire, and now, to win that same war, the Spartans were willing to sell the Ionians out to Sparta's old mortal enemy. It worked. The Spartan-Persian navy ambushed the Athenians at Aegis Potami, located at the site of the red dot on the map, which is a particularly vulnerable point for Athens. Athens had to import its grain from the Black Sea, and now, in addition to losing its navy, the supply route for Athens' food was in Sparta's chokehold. Athens had already rebuilt nearly its whole navy once. It could not afford to do so again. The Decelean Spartans moved down to the city and besieged it until Athens surrendered unconditionally. The city was not destroyed like some had feared. The reasons are a little complicated, but the long walls were torn down, and the democracy was abolished, for a little while at least. There was no Athenian Empire anymore.